Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As this is likely my last chance to speak in this session, I wanted to start by taking a moment to thank my team in Ottawa, James Hammond, Justin Vossenberg, Zhenglin Liu, and Nick Watts, and at home in beautiful Northwest BC, Eric Holdyke, Adele Yonker, Josh McLeod, Ben Tassell, and Enya Watson. Their hard work over the past year, I know all members understand what I'm talking about. The challenging conditions of the pandemic, their work has been exemplary and it's deeply appreciated. I also want to recognize my amazing colleague, the member for Victoria, and her legislative assistant, Alicia Tiffin, for their hard work on the bill that we're discussing this evening. In my remarks earlier this evening, I talked about the various aspects of accountability in this bill and the hope that those parts will work together to hold the federal government to account in the future. The stakes are exceptionally high on this issue, so admittedly, it's difficult to accept what is an imperfect bill. And to be frank, we don't yet know if it's going to do the job, but we can't afford the time it would take to do it over again. We must move forward. It's important to note that Bill C-12 provides a system for tracking action, but it is not action itself. And concerted action carried out with the urgency that this moment demands has been the missing ingredient in Canada for the past 30 years or more. We need action on electrifying transportation and expanding transit, Madam Speaker. Action on retrofitting Canada's buildings. Action on low-carbon manufacturing and industrial processes, action on clean power generation and transmission infrastructure, action on nature-based solutions, action on smart, sustainable community land use, action that Canadians can see and touch and feel, and most importantly, Madam Speaker, action at a pace and scale that matches the crisis before us. If this bill passes into law, we will await the emissions reduction plan that will be required within 6 months. The contents of that plan, not this bill we're debating tonight, will determine whether Canada is serious about reaching its targets and doing its part to mitigate runaway climate change. Canadians, particularly young Canadians, will be watching to see if we are sincere about the climate emergency that was declared in this place just 2 years ago. Seth Klein, in his compelling new book, A Good War, talks about the need to mobilize our country around climate in a way that hasn't been seen since the Second World War. In his book, he lists 4 markers that indicate a government has shifted into emergency mode. Here they are. First, it spends what it takes to win. Secondly, it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. It shifts from voluntary incentives to mandatory measures. And fourth, and most importantly, it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis, and it communicates a sense of urgency about the measures that are going to be necessary. Looking at the past year and a half, we can see this emergency mindset at work in Canada's response to the pandemic. And this is something that Mr. Klein notes in his book. But we have yet to see it on the climate issue. Sadly, the approaches to date have been tentative, not transformational. It's clear we need to do much, much more, and we need to do it rather quickly now. Now, I want to talk about an important aspect of our climate action future, and that is the need for a just transition. With the recently announced targets and this bill, we bump into an uncomfortable truth, the elephant in the room, Madam Speaker, at the heart of Canada's climate predicament, and that is emissions from oil and gas, which have been rising faster than any other sector in Canada. Between 1990 and 2019, emissions from this sector grew 87%. Paul Fautou worked for the federal government as a diplomat and a senior official from 1980 to 2010. He directed Canada's climate change Bureau, and he led the Canadian delegation in the negotiations on the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol. At committee, I asked Mr. Fautou why he thought successive federal governments have posted such dismal results when it comes to climate action. Here's what he said, quote, Canada's climate policy has had, in effect, in reality, as a main objective the protection of Canada's oil and gas industry. It has not been truly designed to protect the climate. The proof of that is that after all these years of climate policy, emissions keep going up. Emissions from oil and gas in particular keep going up. Last month, the International Energy Association, that granola crunching think tank founded in 1974 by noted leftist Richard Nixon, laid this out very bluntly. In modeling the pathway to net zero by 2050, the IEA asserted that the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure needs to cease this year. That's a stark statement. Just this past Saturday, the Prime Minister endorsed a communique at the G7 that explicitly notes the IEA's pathway. Madam Speaker, the fourth marker of a climate emergency mindset is telling the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicating a sense of urgency about the measures that are going to be necessary. We need the Prime Minister and his cabinet to be honest with Canadians about how they plan to reconcile the widening gap between what Canada is doing and what it must do. And of all the Canadians who deserve the truth, Madam Speaker, workers in the oil and gas sector top that list. Clean energy does create jobs, a lot of jobs, but in some places and at some times, a rapid transition is likely to affect workers. And they deserve a government that tells them the truth and that has their backs with a just transition. Now, I still feel relatively new in this place, Madam Speaker, and I've been reflecting over the past several hours on our adversarial system, and not only the results it produces, but the way sometimes it pits parties against each other, even on matters where there is broad agreement. It seems to me that climate should be an issue of such grave concern that we somehow find a way to transcend that, to come together. And I suppose if this bill passes tonight at the 11th hour, we can claim to have done so, at least in some small measure. Among its weaknesses, the original bill had strengths too. And that's not something I mentioned earlier. Many of the amendments the Green Party and the Bloc brought to committee reflected our desire to see this legislation much stronger. And while I did not agree the Conservative amendments strengthened the bill, I appreciate that they are at long last grappling with the climate question in a much more serious way. In a minority parliament, the opportunity is to work across party lines to create agreement that can enjoy the majority support of the House. Yet, when that occurs, it's so often framed as backdoor deals or an unholy alliance, in the words of one parliamentary secretary yesterday. The fact is, the NDP did work in good faith with the government to explore the potential for strengthening the bill. Guilty as charged. A bunch of the ideas we brought forward are now reflected in the bill, and to their credit, our colleagues in the Bloc voted for all of them, if I recall correctly. A brief story to finish my remarks, Madam Speaker. Bill 41 was a piece of provincial legislation in my home province of British Columbia. It became the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, a much needed and long overdue piece of legislation. There were a lot of questions and vigorous debate over the course of its passage through the legislature. But you know, when the BC government brought forward its Bill 41 for a final vote in the legislature in Victoria, it was carried unanimously by all three parties in the House, every single MLA. What a statement about the importance of Indigenous rights to the future of our province. With the recent vote, the bill before us now has amendments from every party in this House. Each of our parties has conveyed to Canadians that climate is an issue of urgent importance. Imagine the message it would send if we all stood together in this place tonight and carried this bill unanimously. That's my hope, Madam Speaker. And I hope too that this bill marks a turning point in Canada's effort to tackle the climate crisis. Years from now, let's look back on this point and say it wasn't perfect, but we stood together and we got it done. Thank you, Madam Speaker.